Okay, now let's start coding out our Ollama chatbot. Now what I have pulled up on the screen here is the code repo where the starter project template resides. Now you can get the link down in the description and it will take you here. I'm going to scroll down here further in the README documentation. I have a starter project already set up here, so I'm going to copy this and I'm going to open up Terminal and I am going to clone this in my downloads folder here. So I've cloned that. I'm going to go to my downloads folder. I'm going to rename this here, starter. And now I've renamed that folder. And I'm going to open this in VS Code. So you can pick your code editor of choice. I prefer VS Code. I've been using it for years. So I'm going to use that as my code editor. So I'm going to open up this project here and expand this and go full screen. And now I am going to briefly outline the project structure before we start coding this out. So we can see here that we have some folders and we have some files already created. That way you don't have to start from scratch. Now the first thing I have here is a folder called helpers. Now I've got a helper method in here called LLM helper. And you can see I've just stubbed out some of the methods that we're going to have here. So I have a chat method and I have a stream parser method in here. And then next, if we go and go back out and go to the config folder. So this is, or config class, I have a config class set up here where we're going to put some configuration that we're going to need throughout the application. That way we don't have to hard code anything anywhere. We can just set up some constants in here and refer to those. And the last Python file that we have here is the Ollama chatbot. This is where we're going to have the bulk of our functionality here, which allows the users to interact with our chatbot. And then one other file to call out here is the requirements.txt. Now there are two dependencies in here. There's an Ollama dependency and a Streamlit. So we're going to be coding this, the front end user interface, with Streamlit. Now I'll be referring to some documentation for Streamlit as we build this out. The same for Ollama. Now if something doesn't make sense for you as it relates to Ollama, be sure to check out the first video in this series. It's down in the description if you have some confusion about how to set up Ollama, because the first video covered how you should configure Ollama on your computer. Okay, so now that we've got the structure of the project covered now we're going to actually start jumping into some code here. Now I am going to open up a new terminal window here. At the bottom, there is some dependencies. Let me blow this up a little bit here, and that should be enough. Now there are some dependencies, as I mentioned here, that we are going to need to install in our Python environment in order to run this. Now I use Anaconda for my Python environments. Now also, if you're not sure how to set up your own dedicated Python environment, there is a link to a video that I created that'll show you how to set up your own Python environment. Now I'm just calling conda activate Streamlit, so I'm using Anaconda again as my dedicated Python environment. Now we can see that that Python environment's activated there. And now I am going to run pip install -r requirements.txt. Now this is going to make sure I have all the necessary dependencies set up. I already had installed them here. If you hadn't, it would download them and install them in your Python environment. All right, so we've got our dependencies set up. Now let's actually jump into some code. We've done some basic housekeeping before we dived into the code here. So the first file that we are going to code up is the config file. Like I mentioned, we need this file here because we're going to use we're going to configure some baseline settings in this file. I'm going to close that out. I'm going to close this out here so we get more real estate. Now, I already got some code created here. That way, just to save some time, that way you're not having to watch me type out code. I'm going to paste in some code or copy in some code over into this file here. Now, the first constant that I've created here is called page title. Now, we're going to use this in our chatbot where the title is going to show up in the top nav area and also within the page itself. Now, the next constant that I'm going to set up here is going to be Ollama models. Now, these are the models that I've downloaded on my computer with Ollama. Again, if you're not sure what's going on with this here, refer to the video 1 in this series down below in the description. So here you can see I've got a tuple with just the names of the different open source models I'm going to use. So we have Ollama, 7 billion parameters, 13 billion parameters. We've got the Llama 2 Uncensored, and then a couple more models here. And next, I have a system prompt. Now, this system prompt is going to be what our model refers to when it is looking at its capabilities. You can see here, I just told the model that you're a helpful chatbot that has access to the following open source models. And we're referring to this constant here so the chatbot knows what models it has access to. So if someone ask a question related to the models it had access to, it can answer it. And then you can answer questions for users on any topic. Now, this covers the config class that we set up. Again, we're using this to make coding easier, minimize hard coding things such as strings and values that we know we want to be set a certain way. All right. So now that we've coded the config file, let's jump in to start coding our chatbot. Now I am going to pull in some imports here. I am not going to type them out here. Pretty boring. All right, I forgot. We've already got the import statements in here, so we don't have to do anything with that. We now need to set up the page title that will show on the browser tab here. Now, this is a Streamlit feature here that's built into Streamlit that allows us to set the page title. Now, I'm going to jump over to the Streamlit documentation. That way, for you all who may not be as familiar with the Streamlit library, you all will get an idea of what this is here. I am going to go here, and then I'm just going to type in Streamlit, and we're going to go here. Now, this is a Streamlit documentation. This allows us to build our user interface here, and we have the docs section. So we're going to go up to docs, and I'm going to type in or paste that set page config. Now, you've got quite a few properties here that you can set, and if you scroll further down, you can see an example of how to use this in your code. I'm only using I'm just using the page title in the initial sidebar state here. So this is how you would go about looking up how you would use certain features of the Streamlit library. So now we have an understanding of that. Let's jump back over into our code. And so we've set up the page configuration. Now we want to set a page title on the actual user interface here. Now, I could do this and type in, page title, but I may want to use this title somewhere else in my application. Now, that's why I set up the config class with some constants there. And you can see these are loaded by default. We want to use the page title. Now, we don't have that hard-coded in there. Now, I'm going to save this, and let me save this file. And now let's test it and make sure our application is running properly in the browser before we code on any further. Now I'm going to open up a new terminal window here, and let me minimize that a little, and we're going to type in Streamlit run. Now the name of our main chatbot file is Ollama _chatbot.py. So that's what you will type in order to get your chatbot to start running. Now we're just doing this just to make sure everything's functioning properly for us. Oh, wrong. Actually, I forgot. We need to make sure you'll get this. If you're running this in a dedicated Python environment, you'll have to make sure you're running this command in the proper terminal. So if we go back here, I'm going to run clear to clear that out. And you can see I have my Streamlit environment here loaded. So just make sure if you see that error that you're running the proper Python environment. Now I'm just going to paste that in there and then click run. And then we can see that our Streamlit application loaded with the page title here. So it just says Streamlit Ollama Chatbot. So we know it's functioning. Now we can move further on and code a little bit more functionality here. So let me go back to the code editor here. And now we're going to start coding out our state management here. Actually, we're going to start coding out our sidebar. So the option for users to select different models, that's what we're going to code out next. Now, I am going to go ahead here and paste in some code. Let me minimize this, open this. And now you can see the code here says with st.sidebar. And then we can see underneath that, we have st.markdown. And we can see chat options. So this allows us to print out markdown. And this here creates a sidebar in the user interface. So again, I like to show documentation. And let's go back here and type sidebar and look at the documentation for the Streamlit sidebar. Now you can see here, it allows you to add widgets to a sidebar here. Now, if you scroll down, you get some different examples here of how you could add different widgets within that sidebar. And so this is what I always recommend. I always recommend getting comfortable with the documentation for the libraries that you're using. That way you can always refer to them. And then if you run into some issues or want to know how to configure it, you can just refer to the documentation. All right. So now you know what the sidebar is. It gives you the ability to add a sidebar with widgets. Let's add a widget to the sidebar. So we're going to go back to our code editor. Save this. And we're going to add a drop-down box or select box widget here underneath within our sidebar. I'm going to paste that in. And just a heads up, the with st.sidebar means that we're running anything under here that's indented underneath the with, it's running in the context of that sidebar. So just a heads up there if you're wondering what that syntax is. Now you can see I have some code here. I call this variable here model, and it equals an st.select box. And what I want the user to initially see, or the label to say, is what model would you like to use? And we can see that we're referring to our config class that we configured when we started building out the code. We can see that we're using the Ollama models constant in that config class, and you can see it's just passing back all the model values to us, because this select box expects tuples to be passed back. So that's why if we go over to that config file, that is why we pass these as tuples or tuples, whatever you want to call them. And that's why we set them up in this manner. Let's go back to our code. And also, let's go over here and see the documentation for the select box. Now, like I said, all of this code will be down in the description, which will take you to the completed code repository. Now, if we go here and click, it's going to take us again to the Streamlit documentation. We can see all the different options that we have here. And then it shows us an example of code, and then it shows us the output. So we can see that email, home phone, mobile number now show up here. And you can see the type is tuple. And then we can also see the label here that's above that. So that's how you use the select box. Pretty straightforward there. Let's go back to our code. Let's save this. Now let's run this really quick just to see what our user interface looks like. Actually, we already have it running. Let me close these two terminals. And we can just go back here. No, let me go back. And we can just go down to the terminal and just click on that link there. Let's refresh. Let's rerun. All right, so maybe we will need to restart that. Doesn't seem to be showing the updated user interface. All right, so let's stop this, clear it, make sure we've saved everything, saved all our files, and then we're just gonna run that again. All right, so yep, I just need to rerun that. And we can see over here to the left, we have our chat options. And then it says, what model would you like to use? And you can see it's populated with the options that we've selected for Ollama to have access to these particular models. So you can see we have CoLlama, the different versions. We have the 7 billion parameter, 13 billion parameter. Then we have the Llama Uncensored, which allows us to ask questions that may not be appropriate to pass over to a model like OpenAI. Right? Like if you ask certain questions of OpenAI, that it deems inappropriate, it will censor those and will not respond to you. But this model here will respond to us. So again, when you're using these uncensored models, use them at your own risk. Be responsible when you're actually using these models here, because this allows you to no longer be tied down to a third party or closed model such as OpenAI or Gemini or something like this. This allows you to run this model directly on your laptop or your computer, and you've basically got your very own version of ChatGPT, and that's what we're basically building here. Okay, so now that we see that the user interface is updated with our select box widget over here with our models, let's go back and let's continue to code out our solution. Next, we are going to add the code that allows us to track state, so the message state. So here I have some code that I've added here that basically checks to see if messages already exist in session state. Now, session state is a nice feature that's built into Streamlit already for us. You don't have to code this from scratch. Anybody who's done web development in the past and had to manage state knows that state management is not the easiest thing in the world to do. So you're getting this straight out of the box with Streamlit. Now I'm going to click on the documentation. That way you all know what it looks like here. And then it just walks you through what session state is, how you can go about using it, how you'll go about initializing session state, and how you can read values and write values to the session state. So that's session state at a really high level there. For those who are familiar with web development, this is not a foreign topic at all. All right. So we've set up our code to track our messages in session state. Now let's set up our code to write out the messages that we get back from the chatbot. Because once we ask a question of the chatbot, we want the ability to show what the user asked and also the ability to show the response back from the underlying model. So I'm going to add some code in here to display chat messages. All right, so you can see here, I am looping through all the messages that we're going to store in session state. So we haven't stored any messages in session state yet. But once we ask a question further down in the code, you'll see how we're adding the messages or the questions from the user to session state and the response back from the underlying model to the session state. So that's all this code does here. We're getting, you can see here we have the with st dot chat messages, and it looks at a particular role that we're storing in that message. Now, this allows the underlying Streamlit UI to know what type of icon should we show when we iterate and print these messages to the screen. So based on the role, it's going to dictate what type of icon we show beside the message. And this is out of the box, built in for you within Streamlit. So if you've ever built a chatbot or anything like that from the ground up and trying to track certain things and build out, all the different features, it's quite involved, and this does a lot of the heavy lifting behind the scenes for you within Streamlit. And then again, we grab the content of the message and we just print that out in Markdown. So that's all this piece of code is doing right here. All right, so now let's actually start coding up how we get a message or a question from a user. So I'm going to add some code snippet here. Now, here we're checking, we're actually declaring a variable, but also checking the value at the exact same time. So we're saying if the stchat input, now stchat input is a widget that displays a text box and a button to gather input from a user. Now, normally you would have to code that completely from the ground up. With this one here, you do not. Let's go look at the documentation really quickly on the Streamlit documentation. So here it tells you displays a chat input widget. And let's scroll down further, and it's going to show us an example of what this widget looks like. So the stchat input creates this text box here and this button here for you, and it adds validation behind the scenes for you. So if someone hasn't entered input, they can't click this here. But if they have put in an input or put in content or text, you can see this is now enabled. So if you've built a web application before in the past, like coding this, putting the button there, doing input validation, all of that type of stuff, it's not super hard, but it's some work for you to have to do. This does all of that behind the scenes for you. So that's what the st.chat input is. All right, let's go back to the code. And so again, we're just saying if there's input, and actually let's change this. What would you like to ask? All right. And if there's input in that chat input box, we assign it to user prompt. And then next, we are using the chat messages widget again. And we're saying this chat message widget is from a user. Now, based on what we put here, it's going to determine what the icon looks like. So if this is a user, the icon will look like just a human head, right? And so if you remember in video 1, when I was demoing the chatbot and you look at the icon, they were showing a person. So we're just saying, hey, we want this to show as a user icon or a person icon. And then next, the ST markdown allows us to output whatever the user's asking right here. So this gets assigned, and then we just output whatever the user asks to the screen as markdown. So that's what that piece of code is doing there. Okay, so let's code our next piece here. And we are now going to add whatever the user is asking to state. Fix that here. So you can see I am calling st.sessionState and the messages, because remember we initialized this up here. This is where we're initializing this as an empty list. And we just say we want to append whatever the user asked into that list there. Now, we're passing in a dictionary because that's what the underlying Streamlit model expects. And also what we're going to be passing, actually we'll jump into that further, but just know that we need to pass this dictionary in with role, and the role type is user because this is from the user's input. So that's why we're setting the role to user. And then the last thing there we're going to place in our set is the content. And the content here is going to be whatever the user asked. All right. So let's see if we can test it out and see if it'll at least echo back whatever the user is asking. Let's go back to here and rerun that. Okay, so now you can see down at the very bottom, we have our input fill, and then we have our button there. Let me clean up some of this here. I'm just going to say, who are you? So obviously we're not going to get a response back from the model since we haven't written that code yet, but we can see here that it'll at least echo that out. What time is it? Yeah, so we're getting whatever the user asked printed back out on the screen. And you can see here that the little icon next to it is a human head. Again, remember when I said, let me go back to the code. When we set this as user, that chat message, because this container here represents the chat message that we're seeing here. So that's why we're getting that little human head there show up. All right, so we can see that so far the application is coming along for us. We're not yet communicating, though, with the underlying models, though. So let's go ahead and start coding up some of that code there. Let's go back over to our IDE. Let's go over here, and we're going to start coding out the helper file. Now, you can put all your code here in this main file. I like to keep it clean as possible here and only put the necessary code that I need in here. I don't want all the code that communicates with the large language model in here. Then the code gets pretty unreadable. All right, so let's go over to the LLM helper. And again, I've already stubbed out some things. I've imported Ollama. So Ollama is going to be the Python library that we use to talk to the underlying Ollama models that we've installed. And then the next thing here, we have imported our config file because we're going to use some settings from that config file there. All right, so let's first set our system prompt here at the top. So I've created a variable called system prompt, and again, we're just using that config class, and we're just calling system prompt. That way we don't have to code that ourselves, or we don't have to hard code the system prompt, and which could get error prone, because if we go over to, let's go back to our config file here, and you can see the system prompt is pretty, it's a lot of text there. So just to keep it clean, we just keep it over in this config file. All right, so let's go back here. Now, let's go ahead and code up the chat function that we have here at the very top. So I'm going to paste the code in here, and then I'll talk through it and explain what it does. Now, here, we just created a variable called stream, and the reason I called it stream is because we're going to be streaming the output back, so we can get that same feel of user interaction that you get when you're using ChatGPT. So when you ask a question and it starts responding, it just streams it back to you a little bit at a time instead of waiting for the entire reply to come back. So that's what the stream parameter does here. Now we can see we just call ollama.chat. Now this is a built-in method here that allows us to easily chat with our underlying models. Now, does it set this parameter here, the model parameter? Now, once we start coding out our chatbot, we'll be passing in that model from that drop-down list, and then we'll be setting it here. And then here we have our messages. Now, the first message that we're going to have in this messages array is set as a role of an assistant. So that's what the model expects to come through. So when the model sees assistant, it knows that it's talking about the model. And then the content, the very first piece of content, we're setting the system prompt. So this is telling the model what it can do. This is a way of us steering the model in a certain direction. And then the next dictionary that we have here, you can see is set as role, and we set it to user because this is going to be the question that the user is asking. And you can see this is going to be passed in to this method here. And then the last thing is the content that the user passed through, or the prompt that they passed through. But I've added a little extra bit here where it says model being used is model. That way, if a user says, hey, what model are you using? The underlying model knows how to respond. So I'm just adding a little more context to what the user is asking. And then I pass the raw user prompt here. So this would be the question that's showing on the screen that the user asked. And then I explain what the stream is, just allows us to stream that back. And then we're just going to return that stream back to the chatbot, and we're going to process that and print the response back out on the screen. Now, I just have a helper method here that I am going to add the code for. All right. So here we're going to get the stream back in chunks. So I just said, hey, loop through the stream and call the chunks. And then each chunk, we're just going to get the message and the content pass back. And so we're just going to say, hey, loop through every single chunk and then grab the message and the content of that message and pass it back as the model responds back to the user. So that's really all there is to the LLM helper. This is the core functionality of the chatbot. If we don't have this, our chatbot doesn't work. All right. So if you've got any questions as I'm explaining the code, feel free to put the questions down below and I'll get to each comment as I have time. Okay, now let's go back to our Ollama chatbot file and let's finish coding this out here. So this is gonna finalize our chatbot, and then we'll get to actually see it in action. Now I'm going to add something just for user experience. I'm going to add a spinner here. Now let's go check out the Streamlit documentation. We'll just go here. That way you know what this is. Go to docs, and then I'll just type in Streamlit spinner. And it does pretty much what you guess it does. It shows a spinner on the screen and allows us to add some text, right? So waiting for ... and then it has a sleep status, and then you can put success. So that's all this is here. Allows us to let the user know something's going on behind the scenes. All right. So we'll go back to our code here. Now we're going to start communicating with the underlying model. Now you can see again, I used with st.spinner and I indented everything in. So anything that we call underneath this spinner is going to sit and wait to be completed before that spinner disappears. So what we want to do is talk to the chatbot or talk to the underlying model and then wait for the response and wait for that to finish be printed out before this disappears off the screen. So that's why we have this here. Now we can see I've created a variable called LLM_stream and it equals chat. Again, remember chat is this method here that's over in our LLM helper. All right. And so we just call that and then we pass in the user prompt and we pass in the model that we want to use here. So you can see that it can detect all the different models right here. But what we're doing is we're grabbing whatever the user selected from that drop-down box here is assigned to the model variable. And then we just assign that to the model parameter that's passed to the chat function there. So it's pretty straightforward. If you've got any questions, let me know. And now when we get the stream back, we can't, it's not a big blob of text. It's actually a stream of data that we need to process. So that's why I created the helper function there within the LLM helper. So let's add the bit of code that allows us to stream output here. Now you can see here, I just called it the variable is called stream output and I call st write stream. Now there is let's go back to the documentation. Let's just type in st stream write, and you can see here, this allows it to get a stream object back, and it handles the writing of that stream back to the screen here for us. So that's the purpose of st write stream, because there also is a function here called st write, and you can just write plain text to the screen. But since we're not dealing with plain text, we're dealing with a stream of data, we're going to use the st write stream. All right, let's go back to the code here. And you can see I'm calling the stream parser function that we created in the LLM helper. I'm just passing that the LLM string, and let's go back there. And you can see we're just looping through and we're passing that back. Every little chunk that it iterates through, it's passing it back and it's writing it to the screen. So that's what's going on there. All right, let's go back to our chatbot file here. Now let's write our last piece of code for our chatbot. And here, all we're doing is we're taking the response, the stream output that the model sends back to us. This is the final output here. And then we're adding that to the session state here. So we can see we're adding it to the session state, and then we're appending it. And then you remember when we were at the user, the role was user up here. Now, because this is the model replying back, we're setting the role to assistant. And then we're setting the content to be the output that the model gave back to. That's what that does there. We've coded our entire chatbot pretty straightforward. We could add some other features like tracking the history of messages and stuff like that. But I want to get you a firm understanding of just how to build your own chatbot using Ollama. And then we can add other features as we go along. And if you've got some ideas or you'd like to see some other features added to chatbots, let me know down below. And I'm more than happy to build out content related to that. Now let's open the terminal again. And our chatbot's already running. Let's go to the chatbot. Okay, we've got our final Streamlit Ollama bot loaded here on the screen. Now I'm going to go over here and we can see the different models that I have installed on my computer with Ollama. Now you'll have to be sure that you have loaded these models within Ollama. So if you're not sure how to do that, go check back in video 1 down in the description on how you would go about accomplishing that. Now I'm just going to select the 13 billion parameter Ollama or CodeLlama model here, and I'm going to see if it'll write some code for me. This model is fine-tuned to write code and debug code. I'm going to ask it, write me Python code with multiple classes and functions. And let's see what kind of output we get. One thing to call out, the models, after they're sitting for a little while, they'll expire outside of your memory. And so they'll have to be reloaded into memory. I get pretty good performance here because I'm running on a 36 gigabytes of memory on a M3 Mac. Now we can see the results that were sent back to us from the CodeLlama model here. It wrote a couple classes here, so it's following directions pretty good, and it's showing some functions inside of those classes, and then it gives you a brief description down below of the code there. Now let's go over to the Llama 2 Uncensored model. Now this model is completely uncensored, so at your own risk, ask questions. I'm not going to ask anything inappropriate here on this particular video here, but again, you can download this code and run this all locally on your laptop and see what kind of results you get. I'm just going to say let me say, what model are you using? And see what output I get here. And so it's generating a response here for me, and then it'll stream it out on the screen. And you can see it says I'm using the Llama 2 Uncensored model as part of the open source models available to me. I'm just going to say, what are all of the models you have access to? And here we go. So it listed all the models that the chatbot knows it has access to because the way we set up the system prompt. So it's listing all 6 open source models here in its output. Now, so that wraps up us creating our very own Ollama chatbot with our own models running locally. So we're not making calls out to any type of third-party provider such as OpenAI or Gemini. This is running dedicated on my laptop. So if I didn't want to use ChatGPT anymore, I wouldn't have to. So that's the beauty of running open source models on your laptop. You can build your very own chatbots. Now, if you like the content and you found it useful, feel free to hit like and subscribe below. Definitely tells YouTube to serve this content out to more people that may find it useful. Also, I'm going to be trying to put out content on a weekly basis. So throughout the week, I'm going to have different ideas that I develop, and on the weekend, I'll be recording those videos and launching those usually every Monday or Tuesday. If you've got some ideas that you would like to see, feel free to let me know, and I will get those published out. You know, the best ideas and the ones people tend to ask for the most, I will get those published out. So appreciate you watching the video to the end, and see you in the next video.